There we go. Slowly going there. Okay, so starting with a small word on this super successful company called Tokeny. Well, actually, I would say that we're not yet a successful company, but we have the pleasure of still being alive, which is not trivial nowadays, because if you look at the beginning of this industry, right, 5, 6 years ago with ICOs, everybody was, exciting about this new way to fundraise project. We did ourselves more than 50 ICOs. After 6 months, we made already €1 million of revenue. So that was indeed a good start. And then everybody, that could have a decentralized project did the decentralized project. And you saw the curve of ICO going down. And then everybody was talking about STOs. Right, STOs, so we're going to ride the wave of STOs. And the reality is that the wave of STO was a total failure, because I think that from the probably 20 projects that we launched, some 2 or 3 of them successfully raised money. So of course, the market was very fast to move away from STOs, and now everybody's talking about NFTs, right? So when you are a company like us that's focused on securities and not on crypto, that's a tough decision to make at a certain point of time. And if you compare, our valuation with the like that make the different decision, such as Fireblocks, which is a partner of Tokeny, that raised his last round of 550 million at 8 billion valuation, you say like, that maybe wasn't the right decision to make. Anyway, since we missed this STO wave, then we had, for about 2 years, nothing better to do than to start developing standards. And that's what we have today. We had a team of around 30 people that have developed standards for security token that are open source. Anybody can use those standards. Of course, Linux is also open source, and they find a way to make money. So we hope that we will also find a way to monetize those standards. But those standards are available to anyone and are on GitHub if you'd like to have a look. In the meantime, the market has been catching up a little bit. So we have been issuing more than 80 security tokens now, using our standards, representing around 28 billion of assets. So we know a little bit on how to do that in a practical term. And we also have interesting shareholders. First, we had Euronext 3 years ago. Bad timing for having Euronext on board, because at that time, you remember, obviously, LSCG wanted to sell Borsa Italiana because of the Refinitiv acquisition. So all the energy of Euronext has been focused on that acquisition for the last 3 years. So great investor to have, but no, regretfully for our business. Nevertheless, now there are some development in terms of regulation, DLT pilot regime. And as you know, that directive has been made for CSDs because they have the opportunity to apply for the license before others and be part of the sandbox. So we now have finally projects starting up with Euronext, which is very exciting. Apex, I don't know if you're familiar with Apex. Apex is probably the largest privately owned asset servicer in the world. They manage around 3 trillion of assets for asset managers, including BlackRock, and they have 5,900 clients. And obviously the investment of Apex gave a clear message where this industry is going. Off the record, they are planning to bring around 1 trillion of assets in the next 3 years on the blockchain for all the customers. And they are going to start mailing in about 2 months now to all of them, inviting them to tokenize their assets. So if you wonder where the market is going, definitely that's a good hint. And we also have Inveniam as a shareholder. Inveniam is an interesting company. They do digital twins to enable to do real-time pricing of assets, because obviously it's very hard to sell something on secondary market if you cannot price it. So did you implement it, some additional animation? Not, did I? Let me see. So it's a voice recognition, next slide. Okay, so obviously I had that slide before what happened in Ukraine, so that's probably a counterproductive example, regretfully. But when I want to talk about standard, I have a couple of use cases to show why standards are needed in the industry. And this one, as I said, is a regretful one. But you know that the wide of rail track in Russia is different than in the rest of Europe. And it was made, obviously, to avoid having train going into Russia to invade Russia, right? It's still the case today. Obviously, it's regretfully very timely now that it potentially could serve again. But the reality before that is that no train could travel to Russia because of the lack of interoperability between the rail systems, right? Obviously, you know that reference, but who knows why VHS won over Betamax? Any idea? The porn industry. So you know, obviously, your content. So yes, it's true. Obviously, and I apologize being in Holland that I didn't put the video 2000 because I had one at home from Philips, right? It was a great standard, probably even better than the Betamax, but it lost as well because the industry, the porn industry, selected the VHS standard to distribute its content. So at the end of the day, you know, the quality of the standard is less important than market adoption. If you don't have market adoption, you can have the best standard in the world. It's sort of nothing, right? And of course, probably VHS was a great standard, but then it became very quickly obsolete because there was another standard that came and overtook, you know, from a technology perspective, how content was distributed. So you see, you can bet on the standard, and then 2-3 years after, there was another standard that was basically taking the leadership. That is probably something that, I don't know if you remember those flip-flop phones. We probably haven't seen that much of those phones here in Europe, but those phones were mostly in Korea, South Korea, and in the US. They were based on the technology called CDMA, TDMA, and the characteristic of those phones in that they had no SIM cards. So they had no identity in the telephone. And obviously that's a big difference between the GSM standard because the GSMA put the identity in the center of the phone, enabling you to switch phone and take your identity with you. So identity was really at the core of this technology, which make it, you know, the global standard that we know today, leading to mass adoption. So why do we need standards in this industry, and what for? Obviously, if you take public chain, because I think that we just had a nice explanation on why we don't believe that private chain will work. But if you take public chain, if you take the standard of Ethereum, for example, which is a ERC20 format, the ERC20 is non-permission. That means that if I take an ERC20 and I transfer this ERC20, you will get it. But in a sense, this is great. But if you happen to be Russian or North Korean, for that matter, you shouldn't receive it. It should be blocked. So if you work on public chain, those public chain are non-permission. So there are a lot of things that you need to do when you start dealing with security that you cannot do with the ERC20 standard. For example, empower the issuer. We have a tendency to forget that, but the issuer is responsible for his issuance. So you have to give him the tool to be responsible towards the regulator. You need to be capable of respecting terms and conditions. If you do a distribution to qualified investors or retail investors, how do you enforce that if you have no way to control the tokens? Same for transfer. You know, obviously, if you start dealing with equity, you have shareholder agreements with transfer restriction. How do you enforce those transfer restrictions? And obviously, the same applies to any form of asset, including funds. How do you enforce governance? Taking again the example of an equity, if you have tag-along applying to that instrument, and the government says, okay, I can sell. How do you enforce that on something that is on permission? How do you allow new service offering? Obviously, if you cannot control the token. And how do you guarantee the integrity of the asset? You've seen this example with the Bitcoin, which, by the way, is a non-permission blockchain of people trying to recover the laptop on which they had the private key, because this is the private key that you're using to identify yourself. And if you lose your private key, and what was the amount? 20 million Bitcoin he had on his laptop that is now in the garbage trash somewhere in the middle of England. So how do you guarantee asset integrity? Clearly, this is something that the regulator will never accept. Regulator will never accept that you can lose your asset. It cannot be in the world of finance, right? So for that, you need indeed a standard for enabling all those services. I think that we're missing a couple of of the layout. So obviously, tokenization can be done with the ERC20. It costs around probably $5. So the creating a token is something that is indeed very easy, that you can demonstrate to anyone. But obviously, it's very much like having a Ferrari without wheel. It doesn't bring you anywhere. So in order to create something that is compliant with security law, then it happens at different levels. The first one, of course, is at the blockchain level. You need the infrastructure, and I can talk about it in a second. You need a protocol for the token. As I just explained, the ERC20, which is the sole standard that exists today, is not permissioned, that does not allow you to represent securities. And then you have applications. So this part, blockchain and security token protocol, are things that we have developed that are open source and available to anyone. And the rest are applications that we have developed to make use of those standards. But anyone is free to redevelop the same applications. Blockchain networks, obviously, we started with Ethereum. We remain on Ethereum, despite the fact that a lot of companies offered us quite substantial amount of money to start developing the ecosystem, but we turned them down because we had this vision that if you want indeed to remove all those barriers of entry to enable a path towards critical mass, you need to build on one silo, let's put it this way. And we, from the very beginning, have bet on Ethereum. Now, of course, there was a lot of shortcoming with Ethereum, and I can see now that a lot of those shortcomings have been addressed by the evolution related to what we call layer 2 or EVM compatible. It's important to say that when you talk about EVM compatible, that means that they all use the same programming language, which is Solidity. So there's no such a thing as interoperability between blockchain that are not developed on Solidity. If you use Corda or others, it simply does not work. So what you need to do when you want to create this interoperability is to immobilize the asset on one blockchain and recreate the same asset on a different blockchain under the same terms and conditions. It's feasible, but the problem is when you do that, you become the single point of failure in the network. And I don't see how a large financial institution will entrust startups that are 3 or 4 years old to take all their businesses and become the single point of failure to the network. As I usually say, there is one guy that is the most important person in an organization, well above the CEO, which is the compliance officer that will say no, and that's it. A compliance officer, the CEO will never go against the decision of a compliance officer. And if you are the single point of failure, that will not work for sure. So what we see now with EVM compatible, such as Polygon, you can generate transactions. You see the cost, you see the speed. Obviously, we're not limiting ourselves to Polygon. Polygon was the first EVM-compatible blockchain that we've implemented, but we work also now on Avalanche, on the Binance Smart Chain. And there again, because they are built on Solidity, you can enable all those future promises linked to blockchain, such as DeFi. We work very closely with Polygon to implement DeFi protocol, which is where we see potentially the next big wave of opportunity. At the token level, we have designed, initially we called it the TRX, it was token for regulated exchange. It was nice because we had this great dinosaur. Now we receive in the meantime recognition from the Ethereum community with our own ERC code, which is the 3643, which is not the self-declared code like the ERC 1400, which is just put the brand without consulting with the Ethereum community. So we went to the Ethereum community, we submitted our smart contract, they've been audited, and we received this recognition. So in essence, what the ERC 3643 does is very basic. It replaces the transfer function of the ERC20. So it overrides the transfer function, and it replaces it with a compliance framework. We worked for about 6 months with DLA Piper to understand what were the terms and regulations applying to any type of financial instrument in as many jurisdictions as possible. That's why when we say we cover 170, this is true. In reality, when you cover 20, you cover the 170. But indeed, the framework enables to do that, and across any type of instrument, being debt, equity, fund, or anything like this. So it is a library of smart contracts, so it's not a single smart contract. So if there are changes in regulation, you can update the library without updating the main smart contract, which would require to burn and recreate one. But more importantly, we'll link that with on-chain ID. Because there are certain terms and conditions that, of course, are applying to an instrument, but they are dependent on the quality of the investor. KYC, for example, country of residence, quality, that kind of things. It needs to be linked with an identity solution. So there again, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We took an existing standard from Ethereum. Surprisingly enough, the two standards, the ERC20 and the ERC 734 and 35, were developed by the same guy. If you remember, Fabien Vogelsteller was the one that wrote those standards. So we used that standard for identity, and we started building application on the top of that. On-chain ID is an anonymized credential solution. So what it does, it check on the identity if you have the right. Make the analogy with a passport. You have a passport and a visa. So on-chain ID is like a visa, and then a passport, and on your passport you have visa. It's the same thing. So there's no data available on the blockchain. It's just claims that are written by people that are authorized to do so, like KYC agent. If those claims are not on your identity, the token can simply not be transferred. So it is anonymized, so there's no data. It's just claims. You activate those claims by asking for a transfer of the token. As simple as that. And then, of course, we've built, as I said, application to make use of that. We are going to spin off this activity of on-chain ID because there is great demand in the industry. This does not only limit itself to securities. There are multiple use cases. The first application that we did is to develop a connector called Comply DeFi that enables DeFi protocol to check the identity. For the moment, this is still anonymous, but it won't remain as such. The SEC already made that clear. So you need to have at least a minimum set of KYC assigned to a person. It can be a name, it can be an email address, but you need to have that. We're also using that to launch stablecoin. We signed our first stablecoin client. It's a bank in Bermuda called Joel that does not intend to limit itself to Bermuda. They already signed customers in the US to launch stablecoin in US dollar. We're discussing with bank in the UK to use that as well. So this is obviously a mechanism to represent value and to ensure compliance on anything that obviously represents such a value. I'm almost done. So there are around 120 functions available on the ERC-3643 compared to the 20 of the ERC-20 tokens. And as I said, it's free for you to use that. So and this is obviously something that we would be very keen to discuss with you, how we can use those standards to develop specific use cases that obviously will meet the one that you have already identified. In terms of liquidity, again, the idea here is to build standards. There is, and we know we discussed this morning during the podcast, Milan, but I think that in order to achieve liquidity in market, you also need to enable interoperability. With the newcomers being crypto exchanges, with DeFi protocol, with regulated market infrastructure, but also with OTC platforms. So we have really positioned this token, the ERC-3643, as a standard that can be operated on any of those platforms. And this is, in our view, the sole way, in order to enable that path towards critical mass, which is required for providing liquidity in capital markets. That's it. You have a lot of information on our website. We have published a lot of things recently, ebooks and other documents. We took ourselves, this role of trying to evangelize the market and educate the market, as you said earlier. Did I mention the word tokenization too many times? Yeah. Okay. You see, you got me. So thank you very much, and I will be around, in our table, and if you have questions after that as well.